The envelope was crimson, a stark, glossy red that seemed to absorb the morning light. It was sealed with a gold foil sticker, an almost celebratory touch that felt deeply out of place. Arthur Vance watched the process server retreat down his frosted walkway, his gait suggesting he'd just delivered a box of chocolates, not a hand grenade. It was 8:14 a.m. The sun hadn't yet pierced the thick Michigan fog. His coffee, still steaming on the porch table, was forgotten. He was 64 today. He was supposed to be enjoying the quiet company of the finches at his feeder. Instead, he sat, slit the envelope open, and read the words that shattered his morning peace. Notice of civil complaint. Reed versus Vance. Filed under her name, of course. Evelyn Reed. A name she had theatrically vowed to shed after their divorce but had clung to for professional convenience. The opening was all sterile legalese, precise and cold. Then came the demand. She was seeking retroactive compensation, a marital share the document called it, for profits from an intellectual property transaction Arthur had finalized 6 months ago. Long after the divorce, long after everything. The number was $2.3 million. He read on, his eyes narrowing. They weren't challenging the patent itself. That would be foolish. He'd filed it years before he even knew she existed. But they were attacking the revenue distribution, the deal's structure, fishing for leverage with phrases like latent marital contributions and undisclosed spousal economic entanglements. It was a masterpiece of weaponized jargon. The law firm, Thorne and Associates, was the city's reigning king of civil litigation. Their lead partner, Julian Thorne, was notorious for burying opponents not with evidence, but with an avalanche of motions until they suffocated under the weight of their own legal bills. Their website boasted an undefeated streak in high-net-worth domestic disputes spanning over a decade. Arthur didn't curse. He didn't crumple the papers. He simply peeled the small gold sticker from the envelope, placed it on his saucer next to the spoon, and refolded the letter. A hummingbird feeder swayed gently overhead. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from Evelyn. Happy birthday. Hope you saved up. It was followed by a winking emoji, the one she always used when she thought she was being clever, a digital wink that made his skin crawl. He didn't reply. He reached into the small drawer by the porch door and pulled out an old cedar box. He hadn't opened it in years, keeping it out of habit. Beneath a stack of old insurance cards and forgotten keys lay a single, folded business card. No glossy finish, no flashy logo, just a name in a simple serif font. Alastair Finch, Chief Judge, United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Arthur placed the card flat on the table. It wasn't the money that bothered him. It was her assumption that she could intimidate him, that this puffed-up firm of silk ties and smug associates could corner him like some frightened man with a secret to hide. Arthur Vance had been quiet for a very long time. The patent wasn't a lottery ticket. It was 22 years of solitary work, sketched on napkins in diners and in notebooks during layovers, forged in years when he could barely afford to heat his workshop. Evelyn hadn't been a part of that, but now, having burned through her generous settlement, she wanted another payday. He picked up the card, feeling the embossed letters with his thumb. The last time he'd spoken to Alastair was 7 years ago, just after the judge had retired. They'd had a quiet dinner, just two old friends. Alastair had offered a piece of advice that night Arthur never forgot. The loudest man in the room is usually the one praying nobody asks the right question. Arthur stood, folded the legal notice in half, then again and again, until it was a dense square. He dropped it into the trash, washed his hands, and poured himself a second cup of coffee. His phone buzzed again. Evelyn, seriously, if you want to avoid public humiliation, just call Julian. He'll go easy on you if you don't fight this. Otherwise, well, enjoy the next few months. A clinking glasses emoji. This time, Arthur did smile. A thin, barely perceptible smile. He saved the message, then opened his phone's notes app and created a new folder titled Evelyn Closure. His first entry, 8:14 a.m. Served, 8:22 a.m. Text received. Happy birthday. 8:27 a.m. Message saved. 8:31 a.m. Alistair's card located. Then, with the same steady hand that once drew circuit diagrams under a magnifying glass, he opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in almost a decade. One number, no picture, just Alistair Finch, personal. He didn't press call. Not yet. He just looked at it. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he murmured, "Let's see if he still owes me that favor." The restaurant was a modern bistro his daughter loved, with low-hanging Edison bulbs and menus designed to look like chalkboards. Arthur didn't mind. It was quiet and the tea was good. He chose a booth by the window and waited. Olivia arrived 10 minutes late, flustered and apologetic as always. She slid into the booth, shedding her coat and offering a warm smile. "Happy birthday, Dad." He smiled back, soaking in the moment of normalcy as she hugged him. They ordered their usuals. Then, as the waitress departed, he slid the crimson envelope across the table. Olivia blinked. "What's this?" "Your mother sent me a birthday present," he said, taking a sip of his tea. She opened it, her brow furrowing as she read. "Wait, she's suing you?" "Apparently. I owe her a piece of something I invented in 1999, he said. The year, you might recall, she was still married to her first husband. Olivia's hands tightened on the papers. "This is insane. I thought you two agreed on everything. I mean, the divorce was amicable." "That's what she told you," he finished for her. She looked up, confused. "Wait, it wasn't?" Arthur leaned back, a flicker of old weariness in his eyes. "Your mother doesn't do amicable, Olivia. She does advantageous. You were away at college. I didn't want to drag you into it, but I thought you split everything. She said you took the lake house." "I took the mortgage on the lake house," he clarified. "She took the equity, the cars, the joint accounts, and your grandmother's silver." Olivia stared at the lawsuit, her lips pressed into a thin line. "She told me you didn't want anything else." "I didn't," Arthur said simply. "Not from her. But now she wants a second helping. 2.3 million. Why now?" "Because I sold a license to a company that powers a streaming service she uses, and someone whispered in her ear that if I got rich, she deserves a cut." Olivia set the papers down. "This isn't fair." "No," Arthur agreed, "but it is familiar." There was a long silence as their drinks arrived. Olivia stirred her iced tea with unnecessary force. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. Arthur reached into his coat pocket again. This time he produced a simple, weathered business card, its edges softened by time. He slid it across the table. She picked it up. "Read the name." Blinked. "Read it again," her voice dropping to a whisper. "Wait, is this who I think it is?" Arthur simply raised an eyebrow and sipped his tea. "Dad, this is who you're calling?" she asked, stunned. "He still owes me one," Arthur said, his voice calm. "Is he even allowed to represent people anymore?" "He's not representing me," Arthur corrected. "He's just offering a little advice. Maybe a little presence." Olivia leaned back, looking as if the wind had been knocked out of her. "Mom's lawyers are in for a surprise." Arthur offered a wry smile. "That depends on whether they recognize him before or after they open their mouths." The food arrived, but neither of them had much of an appetite. Arthur was calculating not just the legal angles, but the rhythm of his ex-wife's tactics. Evelyn had always played chess with people who didn't realize they were pieces on a board. She moved quickly, loudly, confidently. It was a strategy that worked until she encountered someone who had memorized the board before she even sat down. "She's going to spin this," Olivia said, setting down her fork. "Make it sound like you're trying to cheat her." "I'm not trying," Arthur said quietly. "I'm just finally declining the invitation to play." "And what happens if she pushes back?" Arthur tilted his head. "Then we let her push. And we don't flinch." He tapped the business card. "She's walking into a deposition with a war chest," he added. "But I'm walking in with the man who wrote the rules of war." Olivia let out a slow breath, then nodded. "Do you want me to keep quiet about this?" He shook his head. "No, I want you to remember." "Remember what?" Arthur met her gaze, his eyes steady. That silence doesn't mean surrender. It means I've already done the math. The rest of the dinner passed in a quiet understanding. By the time dessert arrived, Olivia reached across the table and took the business card. "Can I hold on to this?" she asked. Arthur nodded. "Just don't show your mother." "God, no," she said, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips. "I want to see her face when he walks in." The building had no sign, just a tarnished copper number plate, 1741A, bolted slightly askew onto old brick. The door groaned as Arthur pushed it open, revealing a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. This wasn't the sterile quiet of a modern law firm. It was the weighted stillness of a place that had been listening for a very long time. He walked past the empty reception desk, down a short hall, and into a corner office where the blinds were drawn. Alistair Finch didn't look up right away. He was working on a crossword puzzle, a pen hovering in the air. Without taking his eyes off the paper, he said, "5 letters, synonym for hubris." Arthur replied, "Evelyn." The pen clicked down. Alistair finally looked up. His face was older, etched with deep lines that looked carved rather than sagged. His gray eyes were sharp, almost metallic. He stood slowly. Well, Alistair said, extending a hand. "I thought I felt a disturbance in the force." "You free for a walk?" Arthur asked with a small smirk. "Depends on how fast the wolves are running," Alistair replied. "Come in. Sit." Arthur dropped the thick envelope on the desk between them. Alistair opened it, scanned the first page, and then let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "This again," he muttered. "They're arguing latent spousal contribution," Arthur said. Alistair's brow arched. "She wasn't even in the state when you filed the provisional patent." "She's betting I'll panic and settle." "She's betting wrong," Alistair said, his eyes flying through the pages. He didn't need to linger. The man had written federal precedent the way other men write novels. The language in the complaint used mangled paraphrases of rulings he himself had authored. They were trying to outsmart the architect using bricks from his own building. When he finished, he set the papers aside. "You want me to advise formally?" "No," Arthur said. "Just show up." Alistair tilted his head. "You don't want representation. You want presence." The old judge leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You always were a quiet bastard. And you always liked making an entrance." They sat in silence for a moment. "You know," Alistair said, "the last time I saw Julian Thorne, he tried to correct me on a quote from my own decision. He'll remember me. That's the idea." "I can't appear on the record," Alistair noted. "I'm not licensed to practice anymore." "I don't need you on paper," Arthur said. "I need you in the room." Alistair leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "You sure about this, Arthur? Once I walk in, it's not subtle. She'll know what it means. That I'm not scared." "No," Alistair corrected gently. "That she picked the wrong goddamn battlefield." Another pause. Then Alistair stood, walked to a small cabinet, and poured 2 fingers of a dark, unlabeled bourbon into 2 tumblers. "I'm not drinking," Arthur said. "It's not for drinking," Alistair replied, holding his own glass to the light. "It's for remembering who you were when you had nothing left to lose." He set the glass down. "I'll do it. One condition." "Name it." "Let me walk in last." Arthur nodded once, buttoned his coat, and left without another word. As the door creaked shut, Alistair sat down, crossed out a word on his puzzle, and wrote in pride. Then he whispered to the empty room, 4-letter rebuttal, done. Julian Thorne's office occupied the 31st floor of a steel and glass tower. Every surface gleamed. There was no art, only framed awards and magazine covers featuring his smiling face next to wealthy clients. He strode into the conference room, espresso in hand. "All right, team," he announced with practiced ease. "Are we ready to bury this guy?" The requisite laughter followed. To them, the case was a performance. They pulled the complaint from a template, peppered it with aggressive language, and assumed the weight of their firm's name would do the rest. They saw Arthur Vance as an easy mark, aging, alone, and outgunned. No one bothered to look into who he really was. So, when a paralegal noted that someone with appellate court credentials had viewed the case file online, it was dismissed as a glitch. Over in Georgetown, a different kind of preparation was underway. Alastair Finch sat in a leather chair older than Julian's entire legal team. He worked not from a laptop, but from printouts marked with colored wax pencil. Red for structural flaws, blue for misused precedent, green for laughable assumptions. "They're quoting me," he murmured to himself, his eyes fixed on a highlighted passage, "but they're taking it out of context." He turned a page. Then he leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Their entire case was built on three key misinterpretations of law, each one traceable to appellate rulings he had personally clarified between 2004 and 2011. What Evelyn's lawyers were calling a legal gray area was, in fact, settled law. He closed the folder and sat in the quiet. What was coming wasn't a rebuttal. It was a dissection, the kind of legal dismantling performed not with shouting, but with calm, precise questions that strip a case down to bone dust. That night, Evelyn met Julian for drinks. "Any movement?" she asked, sipping champagne. Julian smirked. "Not a word. No lawyer on file. He's panicking. We'll blitz him in the deposition. He'll cave." "He won't cave," Evelyn said, a flicker of doubt crossing her mind. She lied and said she wasn't nervous. But later, alone in her condo, she remembered Arthur's face at the end of their marriage. He hadn't fought or pleaded. He had just looked at her with a quiet, calculating expression she couldn't decipher, and then he signed the papers. She had told herself it was fear, but now his continued silence felt less like surrender and more like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Back in his quiet office, Alastair locked the file folder in a safe next to a binder labeled Thorn, J. 2009 bar complaint, informal warning. He poured a glass of the same dark bourbon and raised it to the empty room. "To the undefeated," he said softly. "May they enjoy their last illusion." The deposition room was a sterile stage. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, dressed in a sharp navy blazer, a pearl pin her only adornment. She had even brought her own lighting assistant to ensure the camera captured her in the most favorable light. At her side, Julian Thorne exuded a relaxed confidence, flanked by two junior associates who had been up all night prepping. They expected Arthur to arrive looking defeated. At 10:01 a.m. the door opened. Arthur stepped inside, alone. He wore a simple gray blazer and a blue shirt. No briefcase, no notes. His expression was perfectly neutral. Evelyn smiled, the picture of magnanimity. Julian gave a condescending nod. "Mr. Vance, I see you've chosen to proceed without counsel." "That's correct," Arthur said, taking his seat. But then came the sound of more footsteps. Slow, measured, unhurried. The entire room turned as the door opened again. Alastair Finch entered. He wore a dark wool coat over a simple charcoal sweater. He carried nothing. His white hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were like chips of ice. Evelyn's smile faltered. One of the junior associates squinted, a vague sense of recognition dawning. Julian's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the polished table. Alastair walked to the side of the room, gave a single nod to Arthur, and then spoke. His voice was deep and smooth, like iron wrapped in velvet. "I am here as Mr. Vance's legal advisor. I will not be speaking on the record, but I will be present." He placed his coat on the back of Arthur's chair and sat down beside him. "Shall we begin?" The silence that followed was heavy with dawning recognition. Alastair Finch wasn't just a retired judge. He was a legend. His name was etched into the very foundations of federal patent law. Judges still on the bench had built their careers on his rulings, and Julian Thorne had once been publicly and thoroughly humiliated by him at a legal symposium. Julian cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. Of course. Let's proceed." The court reporter began typing. "Deposition of Arthur Vance. commencing at 10:05 a.m. Julian shuffled his papers, his earlier confidence gone. Just before he could ask his first question, Alistair leaned slightly toward the microphone. For the record, he said, his tone conversational, the questions posed today should adhere to admissibility guidelines as outlined in Faraday v. Capstone Systems, 11th Circuit, 2006. Would you like me to cite the specific paragraph? Julian froze. Faraday v. Capstone was his case, a case he had lost spectacularly. Evelyn shot him a confused look. Julian muttered under his breath. It means he knows where all the landmines are buried before we even take a step. Arthur tapped a finger softly on the table. The deposition had begun, but the war was already over. And for the first time, Evelyn realized she hadn't cornered a mouse. She had walked willingly into a lion's den. It started subtly. 10 minutes into the deposition, the air in the room was thick with tension. Julian's opening questions, intended to provoke an emotional response, were met with calm, concise answers from Arthur. The real damage, however, came from the silent man sitting beside him. When Julian asked about revenue timelines, Alistair interjected before Arthur could speak. Objection to scope. The licensing agreement falls outside the marital window as defined by Portman v. Portman, D.C. Appeals, 2012. You are aware that precedent holds in this jurisdiction? Yes. Julian blinked, fumbling with his notes. They tried to pivot, to argue their latent spousal contribution theory. Again, Alistair's voice, slow and steady. That claim was dismissed in Hollister v. Frame Tech, 2007, for lack of material support. I authored the opinion, if that helps. It did not help. One of the junior associates tried his luck. But surely we can agree that marital resources no. Alistair cut in, not even bothering to look at him. Not when the record shows self-funded development traced through Mr. Vance's 2002 Schedule C tax forms, submitted without joint filing. Are you aware of the IRS coding for sole proprietorship exemptions under IP development? The associate froze. Julian dropped his pen again. Evelyn's eyes darted between the faces at the table, a silent plea for someone, and one, to regain control. Alistair never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply dismantled their case piece by piece, reminding them that every legal avenue they tried to explore, he had personally paved or sealed off years ago. This wasn't a deposition. It was an autopsy. Finally, Julian leaned over and whispered to Evelyn, his hand cupped to hide his words from the microphone. We can't fight him. Settle. Now. Evelyn's eyes widened. What? She hissed back. He didn't repeat himself. He just straightened up and announced to the room, we request a 5-minute recess. The legal team huddled by the far wall. You said this was a slam dunk, Evelyn whispered furiously. That was before he walked in. Julian shot back. But he's retired. He might as well have written the damn legal code. Evelyn, he's not fighting us. He's undoing us. He's citing case law he wrote from memory. She glanced back at the table. Alistair sat watching them, his expression neutral, and Arthur had pulled out a small pack of mints and slid one across the table to Alistair, who accepted it with a nod. The simple, calm gesture sent a chill down her spine. There was no panic, no theatrics, just two men who had clearly done this before, and one. Back at the table, Julian cleared his throat. We would like to pause this deposition for the purpose of discussing settlement terms. Arthur looked up slowly. There is no opposing counsel, he said, gesturing to himself. Alistair leaned back in his chair. But we're listening, he said, his voice as calm as rain. And just like that, the undefeated firm folded, not from force, but from the crushing weight of absolute certainty. Evelyn was the first to leave the conference room, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. She didn't wait for her lawyers. She had instructed her assistant to leak the deposition date to a legal blog, anticipating a triumphant story. Now, that story was a liability. She slipped into a waiting car, her phone already buzzing. A text from her daughter, Olivia. What happened? Dad's not saying anything. Another from Julian. I'll forward the draft settlement. Keep it bland. She didn't reply. Upstairs, the paperwork was finalized. A one-time settlement for a fraction of what they'd demanded, barely enough to cover their own legal fees. Full release with prejudice. Irrevocable. It was a white flag wrapped in legal ribbon. As Arthur stood to leave, Alistair asked quietly, "Want to make a statement?" Arthur shook his head. "She'll say enough for both of us." And she did. By that evening, Evelyn had posted a carefully staged photo of herself walking out of the building, sunglasses on, looking poised and in control. The caption read, "We reached a mutual resolution today. Grateful to put this chapter behind me. #onward #strength #Norgrits." Insiders, however, knew the truth. They saw the post for what it was, a desperate attempt to spin a devastating loss. The story never made the blogs. It was just a puff of smoke where a fire should have been. Across the city, Arthur stood on his back porch. He opened the court-stamped folder and found the clause that mattered most, with prejudice. No further claims. He circled it. Then he looked at the final page. Evelyn's signature was shaky, the last swirl of her name a testament to her defeat. She had lost, and he had never even raised his voice. The call came on a Tuesday. "Mr. Vance," a young, nervous voice said. "I'm an associate, or I was an associate at Thorne and Associates. I'm calling off the record. I filed a complaint with the state bar." "About what, exactly?" Arthur asked calmly. "About Evelyn," the young man said. "She directed our strategy. There were memos she altered after the fact, asking us to build a case around a timeline we knew was false. When I raised concerns, I was told to stand down. I refused, so I left." "And the firm?" Arthur asked. "They're pretending it was all her." "Thank you," Arthur said, and the line went dead. He went to his den and unlocked an old file cabinet. He pulled out a folder labeled "Closure," and on a blank sheet of paper he wrote, "State Bar Complaint. Alleged timeline misrepresentation." Then he closed the folder and put it away. Evelyn didn't know yet. She was still trying to polish her public image, posting on LinkedIn about resilience and growth. But her world was already quietly eroding. A week later, Olivia sent him a screenshot of a post from Evelyn asking for recommendations for a contractor for a smaller house, a little outside the city. She had tagged it #fresh start. The game was over. Arthur poured himself a glass of water and sat on his back steps. The quiet was a victory in itself. The voicemail was clinical and brief. Her highest profile client, a design firm she had worked with for 2 years, was re-evaluating their partnership and pausing all projects. Click. By noon, another major client had terminated their contract, citing ongoing uncertainty. Her assistant went silent, then sent a text resigning, effective immediately. "They need someone media neutral," she wrote. "Hope you understand." Media neutral. The word hung in the air. It wasn't about the lawsuit anymore. It was about her. The name Evelyn Reed was now toxic. There was no public expose, just a slow, systematic exclusion. She was quietly removed from project briefs, replaced on speaker panels, scrubbed from company websites. She logged into her business site and saw traffic had dropped by nearly half. Her last blog post had 0 comments. By Friday, her own web developer had taken her site offline. He claimed it was a client request. She didn't have any clients left. She opened her calendar, once a chaotic tapestry of meetings and deadlines. It was empty, save for one lonely, completed event, legal follow-up, settlement certified. The silence in her life was no longer peaceful. It was curated. It was the sound of doors quietly closing all around her. Across the city, Arthur was repairing the squeaky hinge on his garden gate, a small act of maintenance to prevent a slow, avoidable decay. His phone buzzed. It was Olivia. She lost another client. "Word is spreading. People are saying she's toxic." He didn't reply, just saved the text to the digital closure folder. There was no satisfaction in her collapse, only a profound sense of stillness. The noise she had once so masterfully controlled had finally turned on her, not with a roar, but with a suffocating silence. The envelope was cream-colored, with his name typed in an old-fashioned serif font. There was no return address. He knew who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one printed sentence, a line from one of Alistair's old judicial opinions in matters of law. Intimidation crumbles before legacy. Beneath it, a handwritten note. You didn't need me, but I'm glad I came anyway. Arthur smiled, folded the note, and tucked it away. He didn't archive it for sentiment, but because it was a truth that didn't need to be displayed. True power doesn't demand attention. It simply is. He sat on his porch, sipping his tea. He rarely thought of Evelyn anymore. Her life had become a slow leak, the pressure draining away without a single dramatic event. She had always mistaken noise for strength and theatrics for leverage. When her performance failed to provoke a response from him, she had panicked, because his silence was a weapon she could not counter. It couldn't be spun or misquoted. It just sat there, immovable, as she burned her own stage to the ground. Arthur's victory wasn't about punishment. It was about precision, and that is what made it so absolute and so permanent. A neighbor mentioned seeing Evelyn at a networking event. She was alone. She was consulting now, a polite term for being unhireable. Alistair was in Florence, sending photos from quiet cafes. The law is quieter here, he wrote. Or maybe I just listen better now. Arthur looked out at the trees in his yard. They were bare for the winter, stripped down to their essential, patient strength. Like him, they were in no hurry. He thought of the note one last time. Closure. The man she tried to break never shouted. And that, in the end, was precisely why she never stood a chance.